Hello, I'm Robin. Welcome to Bookspin. So, I recently read this book, Dayworld Breakup by Philip José Farmer. This is the last book in the Dayworld series, which is a really intriguing series and an underrated series, I think. So today I'm going to introduce this series and give an overview of what to expect, because it's a really fascinating and futuristic world that Farmer created in these books. So I'll give you my thoughts on each of these books. So if you're interested, this can help you decide whether this is a series for you and where to get started with these books. So Philip José Farmer is the author of the Dayworld series. He is one of my favourite science fiction writers, and he frequently employs pretty crazy concepts and ideas throughout his books. Dayworld is no exception to this. I think the central premise is really compelling, and the sci-fi concepts, the dystopian world building are all captivating. And central to this world building is the concept of a revolutionary piece of technology that is known as the stoner. And this radically transforms Earth society in the future. So what the stoner is it's a kind of cylinder or capsule. And whatever gets put inside the capsule can be frozen and put in suspended animation. Okay, so all atomic and subatomic activity get halted while a machine is turned on. Now, within the society of the novel, this technology has a variety of purposes, but most significantly, people get stoned or frozen within the stoner. Okay, so the way this works is we've got a world government called the Organic Commonwealth of Earth, right? And they have implemented what is known as the new era of human history, or the Dayworld era. And this is a social system in which people only live for 1 day a week. Okay, so you get given an allocated day, Monday or Tuesday or whatever. And then at the end of your day, you go into your stoner and you get frozen. You get put into suspended animation before being woken up again next week. Okay, so if your day is Monday, you will never see Tuesday, Wednesday, or any other day of the week. You just get revived on Monday and then go back to the stoner at the end of Monday. So the days of the week in this system are walled off from each other, and a Monday citizen will never come into contact with a Tuesday citizen. Okay? So the reason we have this system is basically the ultimate solution to overpopulation, because only 1/7 of the population remains active and unstoned at any one time. So the planet can now support 7 times the amount of people as before. And this leads to all kinds of interesting cultural changes and changes in social structure. So, for example, humanity now uses a timekeeping system known as the vertical calendar, in which we distinguish between 2 types of time: subjective time and objective time, or subtime and obtime. Subjective time is time as it's experienced subjectively. So, for example, a period of 3 days as you experience them would equate to 3 weeks of objective time. Okay? And so we use terms like sub-days and ob-days, sub-weeks and ob-weeks and sub-tomorrow, ob-tomorrow, okay, to distinguish between these two types of time. So that's one major change. Another major social change is the way people live, living arrangements. People share their homes with strangers. So the only time you will see your housemates is when you see them through the window of the stoner. Okay, you'll have people who live on your house on other days of the week. So the stoner forms the bedrock of the new era society. And this is a society which, as you can imagine, citizens are quite heavily monitored and regulated in order for the system to operate. And because of this heavy regulation, there are definite dystopian elements. In many respects, this series reads like a dystopian thriller. But at the same time, most people within the Dayworld actually live pretty comfortable lives. In fact, is arguably as close to utopia as humanly possible. Food is provided for everyone. War is a thing of the past. There's very little crime. Everyone has access to good housing, good education and medical care and so on. And a lot of the prejudices of the past have disappeared. Of course, the downside of any such comfortable utopian existence is it has the danger of stultifying humanity. As anyone who's ever read Childhood's End will know. And of course, not everyone is going to be happy in such a society. There is a segment of society who yearn for freedom from government control and a return to a more natural way of living in tune with the natural circadian rhythms and the passing of the seasons and so on. Of course, there has to be some conflict in this world, or there would be no story to tell, or no interesting story to tell. So that is the basic backdrop for the world in which this series is set in. So let's take a look at these books. Now, this series is quite an interesting publication history. It's quite a long history, actually. There are actually 5 different publications to talk about. So the bulk of the series is comprised of the Dayworld trilogy. So that is 3 books. These 3 books. Okay. These were published between 1985 and 1990. And that's probably the point of entry for most people coming into this series. In particular, with the first of these books, Dayworld. But the origins of Dayworld actually go back much earlier to a short story that Farmer published in 1971. And what is more, there is also another novel in the series called Dayworld A Hole in Wednesday, and this is a prequel that got published in 2016. So let's take a brief look at these stories in order of publication. I'm going to start off with the short story, which is called The Sliced-Crosswise Only on Tuesday World, which is a pretty odd title, I think. This was originally published in 1971 in New Dimensions 1, which was an anthology edited by Robert Silverberg. It's been reprinted a few times since. I read it in this collection, The Grand Adventure, which is a Philip José Farmer short story collection published in 1984, which contains illustrations, and it's also got an introduction to each story, which Farmer wrote. So in his introduction to this story, he reveals that he originally got the idea for this story in a dream, which is interesting. So this particular story is set in the year 2214, which is 130 years after the new era began. But of course, this is going by objective time. This is actually less than 20 sub-years. Okay, so it's really only one generation or so. It's still very new in the experience of people living in this world. So in this story, we have a character called Tom Pym, who is a citizen of Tuesday. He falls in love with a woman from another day. Okay, as a woman from Wednesday. He can't actually meet her in person. He just sees her through the window of the stoner in his apartment, and he falls in love with her, and he's desperate to meet her. So he leaves messages for her, and he is so desperate to meet her that he attempts to have his allocated day changed to Wednesday so he can see her. And this is a really hard thing to do. He has to go through endless layers of government bureaucracy to try and achieve this. Now, it's only a short story, so I'm not going to spoil what happens. But it is a neat little story. It's a nice idea, quite entertaining. But on its own merits, it's nothing really special, I think. It's worth checking out to explore Farmer's first foray into the stoner concept. But there aren't any character or plot ties to the rest of the books in the series. It's not essential reading. There are, in fact, much better short stories out there that Philip José Farmer wrote, I think. Now, I don't usually give star ratings to short stories, but just to be consistent, because I'm going to review all of these books, I will give a rating to this one. So I'm going to give this one 3 stars. Okay. That's the Sliced-Crosswise, only on Tuesday World. And then some 14 years later, Farmer used the basic world building and stoner concept from this short story as a springboard for his first full novel in the Dayworld series, and that is Dayworld, published in 1985. So this is the UK hardcover, first edition that I've got here, and I think this is a really beautiful cover. The artist is Tim White. It's a wraparound cover. This is actually one of my favourite book covers that I have in my collection. Isn't that gorgeous? So this book is set much further into the future. It's the year 3414. So a few generations have passed in stoner society. Okay, the old way of life is largely forgotten. It's in the ancient past. The Dayworld system has become so ingrained that a major new crime now exists in the new era called day breaking. And what this means is refusing to use the stoner at the end of the day and illegally moving from one day to the next. So things have become much stricter, actually, in this respect, because early on in the new era, as demonstrated in the short story, people were allowed to move from one day to another under the right circumstances, but now this has been cancelled, and day breaking is a serious crime. So within this world there exists a subversive secret society called the Immers, and this is where we get into the people who are unhappy with the system. Okay, the Immers actually have a secret longevity elixir. They call it ASF, age slowing factor. It's a kind of biochemical compound that allows human lifespan to be extended 7-fold. Okay, so using this means these people are able to daybreak, and they're able to live every day of the week and hide within society. Because their rate of aging is so slow, it won't become apparent to everyone else who's living in subjective time. The Immers can live in objective time. And the protagonist in this story takes this subterfuge to a whole new level. So his name is Jeff Caird, and he is a Tuesday citizen of Manhattan. And he works as an organic, which is the term they use for the cops in this world. He works as an organic while working undercover as a courier for the Immers. And what Jeff does is he takes on a different persona for each day of the week. And this is how he disguises his daybreaking. So on each day, he has a different name, a different identity, and a different home, a different wife, different job, and so on. So on Tuesday, he's Jeff Caird, the police officer. But on another day of the week, he is a fencing instructor. On another day of the week, he is a religious preacher, and so on. So he's living this life, which sounds pretty exhausting to me. But the interesting thing is, it's not just an act for him. He actually becomes a new persona every day. Okay? He takes on a unique personality and memories with only a shadowy memory of his base persona. So it's quite interesting. In a way, it feels like an elaborate form of dissociative identity disorder. It's pretty bizarre. And because of this, the way the novel is structured, we get introduced to him day by day as he takes on new personas. The novel has quite a disjointed narrative structure, but it is essentially a thriller. So once he realizes that the authorities are onto him, he realizes that both he and other Immers are under threat. Now, I won't go into any plot details here, but I will say that this is quite a bold and ambitious novel. The world building, which we've already discussed a bit, is well thought out. It's pretty fascinating. It's an interesting central concept. And the narrative structure is memorable and unique. And I think the character building in this protagonist is very intriguing. It's quite an interesting character study of someone who deliberately fragments his personality as a kind of subversive defiance of the restrictive social order that he's living in. Now, I did find that some of Jeff's personas were more interesting than others, and it's not a perfect novel. Sometimes the action scenes fall a bit flat, but I did really enjoy reading this book, and I think Philip José Farmer deserves a lot of credit for creating such an original and immersive story. It's not just interesting world building or, great plot, but I think the character work, at least in Jeff's character, is fascinating. So I give Dayworld 4.5 stars. The sequel to Dayworld is Dayworld Rebel. This came out a couple of years later in 1987. So this is the UK mass market paperback with cover art by Chris Foss. And in this book, the story takes off straight after the events of the last book. And without wishing to spoil anything, a crisis has forced Caird to take on an entirely new persona. So he becomes a fugitive and an outlaw. The action moves out of Manhattan, and a good deal of the plot takes place in Los Angeles. An interesting futuristic vision of Los Angeles in which the ancient remains of the city are drowned underwater, and what's left are giant towers emerging from the sea, as can be seen from the cover illustration. We learn a bit more about the Immers, and we get introduced to some new supporting characters, one of whom is particularly memorable and entertaining, is a kind of larger-than-life syncretic priest. This is a world which is officially very secular and religion is frowned upon. Anyway, the plot is a lot more straightforward in this one. It's quite action-focused, and it lacks the kind of fragmented character of the first book, since Caird has now taken on a fixed character. It's pretty entertaining, fun to read, but it lacks the freshness and the originality of the first book. It also has quite an abrupt ending, very abrupt ending, with a cliffhanger. Now, you don't have to read Dayworld Rebel. You could just enjoy the first book as a standalone. But if you do read the second book, the way it ends, you pretty much have to read the third book as well. It's necessary to complete the story. Dayworld Rebel, on its own merits, though, it's a decent sequel, but nothing groundbreaking. So I give it 3.5 stars. And this brings us on to the conclusion of the trilogy with Dayworld Breakup, which was published in 1990. Again, we've got another Chris Foss cover in the UK paperback edition. I think this is another one of the LA towers coming out of the sea. I can't really describe the plot in this one without spoiling events from previous books. I'll just say that the stakes get higher, the plot gets more complex, and we do get a resolution to the main story arc in this series, and some expansion into the world building. But the pacing does feel a bit uneven in this one, especially compared to book 2. It slows down a lot in the final 100 to 150 pages and becomes less of a thriller and more psychological in tone. Again, Jeff's character becomes a major focus, his character study. He's definitely a complicated character, so that does make things interesting. But a lot of the supporting characters that get introduced in this one are pretty forgettable, and it doesn't feel as bold or as memorable as the original first book. And some parts of the story drag a little bit. But we do at least get an interesting resolution to Jeff's story arc. So I give Dayworld Breakup 3 stars. And finally, we move on to Dayworld A Hole in Wednesday, which was published much later on in 2016. This is the prequel to the trilogy, published posthumously, since Philip José Farmer passed away in 2009. This is a project which he began work on a long time ago, according to pjfarmer.com, which is an excellent resource for information on all of his works. He started working on this book sometime in the early to mid 1970s, but for whatever reason, he didn't finish it. So, many years later, his great nephew, Danny Adams, completed the manuscript, and this is the end result. So this novel is set in the year 2440, 3 generations after the start of the new era. So between the original short story and the Dayworld trilogy. And while it does have some connections with the characters and the events of the trilogy, it is its own story and can be read as a standalone. In fact, I read this book first, before the original trilogy, because I wanted to read all of these stories in chronological order. But it doesn't really matter, because you could just as easily read it afterwards, or even just by itself. In any case, despite the influence of another writer, taking the helm, it fits seamlessly as a new addition into the Dayworld series. And it does a good job of delving deeper into the world building, the history of the Dayworld, the history of the Immers, and the longevity elixir. So in this story, we have a protagonist called Jerry Carson, who is a history teacher. He is a law-abiding citizen, at least to start with, relatively normal person in the society. However, early on in the story, he uncovers something strange going on with his wife Stoner, whose timer is 10 minutes out of sync with his. Okay, so during their weekly de-stoning, she is waking up slightly later, and at the same time, she keeps on suffering miscarriages. She's suffered 3 miscarriages, and there seems to be a rise in miscarriages in general in society. Jerry suspects that someone has been tampering with timers and embryos, that there's a connection between these 2 phenomena. And frustrated that he's not getting any official answers, he decides to daybreak in order to investigate. Now, this leads him down a massive rabbit hole, right? As he unearths a complex conspiracy, layers conspiracy, involving a shadowy revolutionary organization called Galapagos and another rival subversive group called simply the Family, who he ends up being recruited for. And at the same time, he finds himself being hounded by the government authorities. All of this links up with the Immers from the original trilogy, with their revolutionary agenda and their secret age-slowing factor. So this works really well as a fast-paced thriller. It's definitely a worthy addition to the series. I would say that the action and the intrigue is more suspenseful than the other books. So this is probably Danny Adams' influence, I'm guessing. He seems to have a better flair for writing thrillers. And in many ways, this feels like a more polished novel than the other books in the series. Certainly reads better as an exciting dystopian thriller. However, I don't think it has quite the same level of quirkiness and off-the-wall characters that I come to expect with Philip José Farmer's novels. So I don't think it quite reaches that same level of charm, but it's still a great read. So I'm going to give this book 4 stars. So there you have it. That's the Dayworld series. On the whole, I really enjoyed this series. I definitely think it deserves to get more attention. The central concept is really intriguing. The world building is fascinating. And there are some interesting and memorable characters to sink your teeth into, especially Jeff Caird's character. You don't have to read the whole series to get something out of it, but I do think it's worth reading the first Dayworld novel on its own merits and continuing the trilogy if you want to get the complete story. A Hole in Wednesday, though, is a very good prequel novel in its own right, which I can definitely recommend, not just for completists. Anyway, that's all for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again soon for some more science fiction content.